Welcome to the Chapter 26, Section 4 Guided Reading Video Lecture. This section is entitled Two Nations Live on Edge. We are going to see in this section how both the United States and the Soviet Union came very close several times to all-out nuclear war. As you listen and watch, complete the Chapter 26, Section 4 Guided Reading. You will be looking at several incidents and events throughout the Cold War and be recording the reaction the United States had to these events in Section A. There will also be some vocabulary for Section B that you will record on the bottom of your sheet. If you have any questions throughout, please raise your hand, and remember you can always rewind or pause your video to record your answers. Good luck. Before we get to the guided reading, first take out your notebook and answer the following question as a bell ringer. If you were the leader of a country and your enemy developed a weapon, what would you have to do to keep up? Pause the video and complete your answer. How many of you said that you would have to develop a weapon that was bigger and better? Don't really raise your hand, because that would look silly because you're just looking at an iPad and not a real person. If this were a real scenario, you would have to make sure that your country had at least the same type of weapon as your enemy, if not something even more powerful. If not, you would be in real danger of being taken over or attacked. How many of you have heard the saying, not to bring a knife to a gunfight? Again, don't raise your hand. People are going to start to laugh. This was a similar situation that the United States and the Soviet Union had during the Cold War. Each was trying to outdo, outmaneuver, and outsmart each other and have a bigger, better military and a bigger, better weapon in case things went to war. The United States took the threat of all-out nuclear war very seriously. Sometimes they would distribute pamphlets on how to survive a nuclear attack. In it would be directions on how to safeguard themselves from a possible attack from the Soviet Union. In schools, along with fire drills, students would participate in nuclear bomb drills, ducking under the desk in case of an attack. People would also, in their backyards, construct bomb shelters. In case there was a raid by the Soviet Union, they would have underground shelters that they could stay away from the nuclear attacks.
17th, 1945, the Allied leaders from World War II met in Potsdam for their third and final conference. During one of the meetings, US President Harry Truman was handed a note. "The baby is born" was the code that gave Truman the news of a successful nuclear test. Truman could now tell Joseph Stalin the United States was in possession of a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin understood what he was referring to because he had long been aware of the ongoing US effort to develop nuclear weapons. A few days later, on August the 6th, a US nuclear bomb exploded over the Japanese city of Hiroshima, followed by another one in Nagasaki on August the 9th. The two explosions killed over 200,000 civilians immediately, while most of the survivors died later in terrible agony from radiation sickness. The Soviet leadership realized they needed to build their own nuclear weapon as soon as possible to end the US monopoly on atomic bombs. A team headed by academician Igor Kurchatov eventually succeeded. They worked in conditions of absolute secrecy and were supervised by Stalin's omnipotent security chief, Lavrenti Beria. On August the 29th, 1949, the first Soviet nuclear bomb was successfully tested on the Kazakh steppe at an officially built testing site. Physicist Otto Hahn, a 1944 Nobel Prize winner, said the Soviet bomb was good news because it meant the United States could only use their bomb at risk of nuclear war.
Now that the United States and the Soviet Union both had atomic bombs, they were on a level playing field in the type of weapons they could use in case of a war. Question number 1. When the United States found out about the Soviet Union having an atomic bomb of their own, they reacted by being afraid because the Soviet Union's development of the atomic bomb now took away the United States' advantage they had in weaponry. Under President Eisenhower, The willingness of the United States to go to the edge of all-out war became known as brinksmanship. The fear of nuclear weapons was going to be a constant in Americans' lives for the next 30 years. Please record the definition of brinksmanship in Section B. The second reaction the United States had to the Soviet Union having their own atomic bomb was the development of a new weapon, seen in this video.
You have a grandstand seat here to one of the most momentous events in the history of science. In less than a minute, you will see the most powerful explosion ever witnessed by human eyes. The blast will come out of the horizon just about there. And this is the significance of the moment. This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. If the reaction goes, we're in the thermonuclear era. For the sake of all of us, and for the sake of our country, I know that you join me in wishing this expedition well.
It is now 30 seconds to 0 time. Put on goggles or turn away. Do not remove goggles or face burst until 10 seconds after the first light.
Scientists estimated that an H-bomb, or hydrogen bomb, would have the force of 1 million tons of TNT. That's 67 times the power of the bombs that was dropped on Hiroshima. The United States and the Soviet Union made a mad dash to be the first to develop this hydrogen bomb. On November 1st of 1952, the United States won the race. However, their lead only lasted less than a year. In August of 1953, the Soviet Union exploded one of their own hydrogen bombs. The second reaction the United States had to the Soviet Union exploding an atomic bomb was to begin developing a better weapon. The United States began to develop the H-bomb, or hydrogen bomb, before the Soviets could, to once again regain their military superiority. The CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency, which was recently formed, was huge in supplying the United States with information about other countries and the development of new weapons. Spies gathered information in other countries, and they also carried out secret operations to weaken or overthrow governments that were unfriendly to the United States. Please record this definition in Section B of your worksheet. The CIA was involved in two major covert or secret operations during the 1950s Cold War. The first operation took place in Iran. In 1951, Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil fields. He placed the formerly privately owned industries, mostly owned by Great Britain, under Iranian control. As a result, Great Britain boycotted Iran oil, hurting its economy. The United States feared that Mossadegh would turn to the Soviets for help, so in 1953, the CIA gave several $1 million to an anti-Mossadegh supporter. The CIA wanted the pro-American Shah of Iran, who recently had been forced to flee, to return to power. The plan worked, and the Shah returned to power and turned over the control of the Iranian oil fields to Western companies as it had been before. The United States' reaction to the Prime Minister's actions were to use a secret CIA action to take out the Iranian government in order to establish a government more favorable to Western interests. The second operation took place in 1954 in Guatemala. Guatemala is located just south of Mexico in Central America. President Eisenhower believed that Guatemala's government had communist sympathies because it had been given more than 200,000 acres of American-owned land to peasants. In response, the CIA trained an army which invaded Guatemala. The Guatemalan army refused to defend the president, and he resigned. The army's leader then became the dictator of the country. The United States' reaction to Guatemala giving up United States-owned land to peasants was to again use a secret CIA action to take out the Guatemalan government in order to establish a government more favorable to U.S. interests. In 1953, Stalin died, and the Soviet Union did not have a well-defined leader. One after another, leaders succeeded each other. For a few years, a group of leaders shared power. But soon, Nikita Khrushchev came into power. Khrushchev, like Stalin, believed that communism would take over the world, but Khrushchev felt that it could be done in a peaceful manner. Before Khrushchev took over, the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union seemed to get better after Stalin was dead. The Soviets recognized West Germany and concluded peace treaties with Austria and Japan. However, in 1955, when West Germany was allowed to rearm and join NATO, the Soviet Union grew fearful. As a result, they created the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact linked the Soviet Union with 7 Eastern European countries. Here on the map you can see the blue, dark blue, are the NATO countries, the light blue are allies of the United States, and then the dark red, the Warsaw Pact countries, and the lighter reds, other countries that are aligned with the Soviet Union. Once again, the Soviet Union and the United States were at odds. In 1955, Great Britain and the United States agreed to help Egypt finance construction of a dam at the Aswan on the Nile River. The head of the Egyptian government tried to play the Soviets and the Americans against each other by improving relations with each one in order to try and get more aid from each one. In 1956, after learning that the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser was playing both sides, the American Secretary of State withdrew his loan offer. This made Nasser very angry and responded by nationalizing the Suez Canal, the Egyptian waterway that was once owned by the French and the British. This put the canal connecting the Mediterranean and the Red Sea in Egyptian control, angering both the French and the British. Nasser and Egypt refused to let ships bound for Israel pass through the canal, even though the canal was supposed to be open to all nations. Israel, France, and Great Britain responded by sending troops. The 3 countries seized the Mediterranean end of the canal. The UN quickly stepped in and stopped the fighting. It persuaded Great Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw. However, it allowed Egypt to keep control of the canal. The United States responded by being shocked because the situation did not seem to call for such aggression. And as part of the UN, they ordered a ceasefire and withdrawal of troops.
On November the 4th, 1956, 1,000 Soviet tanks swept into the center of Budapest to put down a revolt that had brought hope, freedom, and a new style of government to the people of Hungary. The rise against Soviet rule had begun some weeks earlier. Ordinary citizens had taken up arms to fight the occupying forces in a bid to free themselves from Moscow's domination and from a government at home that was as oppressive as its Soviet paymasters. For the first time since the communist takeover at the end of the Second World War, the Hungarian national flag was openly on display. Partisans were joined by elements of the Hungarian army, and when they weren't fighting alongside, the soldiers often handed over their weapons to the new revolutionaries, even tanks. The Hungarian government was forced to start negotiations for the withdrawal of Soviet troops and began to admit publicly that it had made serious mistakes in the past. Democratization would begin at once. The Prime Minister, Imre Nagy, also promised to reform the political system to allow all democratic forces on the broadest basis. No one in Moscow was going to allow that. Even as a Hungarian general was negotiating the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Budapest, plans for a full-scale attack on the rebels were being drawn up in Moscow. The velvet glove was about to be removed from the iron fist. The brutalities of that fateful day, as well as bringing dissident Hungarians to heel, caused chaos among communists in the West. Thousands of party members tore up their cards in protest. Even hardliners who'd obeyed the Kremlin line through all its twists and turns over the years couldn't stomach the way Moscow had crushed the uprising. The people of Hungary had to wait another 30 years for their freedom to be restored.
This was the Hungarian people's attempt to free themselves from Soviet Union rule. They had been under control of the Soviet Union since the end of World War II. When they tried to fight for their freedom, the Soviet Union rolled tanks into Hungary, killing approximately 30,000 Hungarians. The Hungarians were only armed with pistols and bottles, and they put up barricades across the streets and fought off some of the invaders. The Soviets were too strong and overthrew them. Nearly 200,000 Hungarians fled to the west. The United States responded to this by protesting the invasion, but could do little to help without going to actual war.
On October 4th, 1957, the world watched in awe and fear as the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first man-made satellite, into space. This little metal ball, smaller than 2 feet in diameter, launched a space race between the US and USSR that would last for 18 years and change the world as we know it. Sputnik was actually not the first piece of human technology to enter space. That superlative goes to the V-2 rocket, used by Germany in missile attacks against Allied cities as a last-ditch effort in the final years of World War II. It wasn't very effective, but at the end of the war, both the US and USSR had captured the technology and the scientists that had developed it, and began using them for their own projects. And by August 1957, the Soviets successfully tested the first intercontinental ballistic missile, the R-7, the same rocket that would be used to launch Sputnik 2 months later. So the scary thing about Sputnik was not the orbiting ball itself, but the fact that the same technology could be used to launch a nuclear warhead at any city. Not wanting to fall too far behind, President Eisenhower ordered the Navy to speed up its own project and launch a satellite as soon as possible. So on December 6th, 1957, excited people across the nation tuned in to watch the live broadcast as the Vanguard TV-3 satellite took off and crashed to the ground 2 seconds later. The Vanguard failure was a huge embarrassment for the United States. Newspapers printed headlines like Flopnik and Kaputnik, and a Soviet delegate at the UN mockingly suggested that the US should receive foreign aid for developing nations. Fortunately, the Army had been working on their own parallel project, the Explorer, which was successfully launched in January 1958. But the US had barely managed to catch up before they were surpassed again, as Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space in April 1961. Almost a year passed, and several more Soviet astronauts completed their missions before Project Mercury succeeded in making John Glenn the first American in orbit in February 1962. By this time, President Kennedy had realized that simply catching up to each Soviet advance a few months later wasn't going to cut it. The U.S. had to do something first. And in May 1961, a month after Gagarin's flight, he announced the goal of putting a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. They succeeded in this through the Apollo program, with Neil Armstrong taking his famous step on July 20th, 1969. With both countries next turning their attention to orbital space stations, there's no telling how much longer the space race could have gone on. But because of improving relations negotiated by Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev and U.S. President Nixon, the USSR and U.S. moved toward cooperation rather than competition. The successful joint mission known as Apollo-Soyuz, in which an American Apollo spacecraft docked with a Soviet Soyuz craft and the two crews met, shook hands, and exchanged gifts, marked the end of the space race in 1975. So, in the end, what was the point of this whole space race? Was it just a massive waste of time? Two major superpowers trying to outdo each other by pursuing symbolic projects that were both dangerous and expensive, using resources that could have been better spent elsewhere? Well, sure, sort of. But the biggest benefits of the space program had nothing to do with one country beating another. During the space race, funding for research and education in general increased dramatically, leading to many advances that may not have otherwise been made. Many NASA technologies developed for space are now widely used in civilian life, from memory foam in mattresses, to freeze-dried food, to LEDs in cancer treatment. And of course, the satellites that we rely on for our GPS and mobile phone signals would not have been there without the space program. All of which goes to show that the rewards of scientific research and advancement are often far more vast than even the people pursuing them can imagine.
The United States reacted with shock to the Sputnik launch. It made many Americans feel very vulnerable to a nuclear attack. Using this technology, the Soviet Union could deliver a nuclear warhead on the rockets to many major cities in the United States. They also felt that they were behind the Soviets in science and technology. The United States is going to work even harder to improve education, develop satellites, and a better weapons delivery system. Another tactic used by the United States were secret missions flying at high altitudes over the Soviet territory. The planes used for these missions were U-2s, which could fly at high altitudes without detection. As a U-2 passed over the Soviet Union, its infrared cameras took detailed photographs of troop movement and missile sites. The United States was nervous at these flights because their existence was not very secretive. Many members of the American press knew that these flights took place, and so did the Soviet Union. Eisenhower himself was ready to discontinue the fights, but authorized one last flight on May 1st. France's Gary Powers, after being in Soviet airspace for 4 hours, his plane was shot down, forcing him to parachute out of his plane. He was then captured by Soviet forces. Once to the ground, France's Gary Powers was collected by the Soviet Union and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was later released in a prisoner exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was very angry at this incident. He withdrew his invitation for Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union. The United States reacted to this event at first by lying about the purpose of the flights so they could continue to spy in secret, but eventually they admitted guilt. You have now completed Chapter 26, Section 4, Guided Reading Video Lecture. Please clear out any apps on your iPad and place your iPad in a slot on the iPad cart. You can then return to your seat and work quietly on Chapter 26, Section 4, Paragraph Framing. When you are finished, you can come up and get it stamped. Thank you.